I do have a cold. I apologize. So hopefully, I don't have like a coughing or sneezing fit. But okay, so hope everyone can see my screen. Let's go to the. Okay, so my paper is entitled Pre-Congressional Experience, Gender, and Floor Speeches. It is both the part of an earlier, or excuse me, a larger work, and then also still very much a work in progress. I'm unfortunately just got the data a little late, and so I still am kind of working through all my analysis as far as making the C-SPAN data work with my larger set. So what I have right now is very descriptive, and I do hope to have some more interesting findings down the road. But I'm happy to hear what people think about the general framework and questions that I'm posing here. So my research question is, how does increasing diversity in the legislature change legislative behavior? And so, as we well know, Congress has become more diverse on many measures, including, of course, gender, race, and also peak pre-congressional experience. And what I'm really talking about here is careers, obviously, that people have before they become members of the House of Representatives. I am focused on the House in this work. And this is just two examples that I have here. The first being that in 1945, Congress was 99% white men. And of course, in 2023, we have almost 30% women and 35% of members of Congress identify as part of a racial or ethnic minority. Moreover, in 1965, for example, we had 75% of members who are veterans, and today that is less than 20%. Another interesting point is that only in 1945, only 50% of members of Congress had graduated from college, and today it's almost 196%. Another perhaps important factor is that members have less political experience that they have had in the past. So we have more political amateurs, meaning people who have held no previous elected position. And there is, of course, some scholarship that suggests that this may have some important ramifications for how legislators behave. So keeping all this in mind, this larger project tries to investigate how pre-congressional behavior or experience affects many dimensions of legislative behavior. And I'm really talking here about roll call votes, fundraising, social media, and of course, floor speeches. Now, this is a little bit of an aside, but you might wonder, how does a presidential scholar get involved in Congress? And I was writing this book with a colleague. It's actually under contract with NYU Press, but that colleague left the academy, so I'm now on my own. So this has been a little bit of an interesting transition for me, and I'm definitely eager to hear if there's places where I'm either missing something or there's things that I should be considering that if I was more familiar with Congress, that I would perhaps be, picking up on some of these things. Okay, so what do we know about gender and legislative behavior? Sort of starting there. And we do know much research has found that congresswomen are typically more active than congressmen. They speak at greater rates on the floor. They spend more time passing legislation. They are often more experienced electorally as freshmen. And they tend to dedicate more efforts to getting women to pursue elected office. Um, Moreover, they tend to be more effective, more policy focused, and more engaged in consensus building as members of Congress. And lastly, we have sort of the classic notion that they focus more on quote unquote women's issues or things like healthcare, women's reproductive rights, and paid family leave. So we do have fairly large body of literature that suggests that women behave differently than men when in the House of Representatives. Now, relatedly, I have here a bit of a review of what we know about pre-congressional experience and legislative behavior. And so we have seen previous scholarship study how former careers influence their participation once they are in Congress. And we see things like more pro-business roll call voting, business background, excuse me, leads to more pro-business roll call voting and a closer relationship with interest groups, political amateurs This is an older study, but it's really the only one I could find that focused simply on amateurs, that they can be important agents of change during times of electoral upheaval. And this may be something that I can sort of update with this work, is how we can view amateurs in A, because there's many more of them, in part because it's much easier with things like social media and the weakening of parties for people to be elected apart from having other prior elected experience. Then, of course, they the research has shown little military experience having little impact on roll call voting, though it may affect the kind of issues that are brought to the floor, so a different kind of behavior. Prior political experience may also influence electability. And then this lack of experience, kind of what I was just referencing as being seen as a plus, right? As being an outsider or anti-establishment in our current electoral environment, this may actually be something that helps people get elected in a way that wasn't true before. Now, if we try to bring together Congress and gender and pre-congressional experience, the notion here is that because political experience is filtered through gender as a social contract, that even when we see men and women having the same experience, that we should expect that those experiences are actually different, right? Because gender is a lens through which these experiences, and of course race as well, is a lens through which these experiences are had, and therefore we might expect that just because both a man and a woman served on local council or in a state legislature, that that might not translate to the same kind of behavior once they get to Congress, because those experiences could have in fact been perceived very differently. And I also think that as we increase the number of women in the legislature, and by that nature, their diversity of experiences also expand, right? And as women are allowed to be in different kinds of roles, or not allowed, or able to take different kinds of roles, that we might also start to see more variation among female legislators themselves. And the bigger question, kind of pulling back, is how does a lack of political experience affect the institution broadly, right? This is a question I think has a lot of importance today, not only because we have a president with no political experience, but also because we see more and more members elected with no political experience. And so I just wanted to take a step back and just talk briefly about socialization, right? And this idea that both men and women are socialized to behave according to sex-specific scripts from an early age. And this really impacts everything. This is really from the sociology and psychology literature that you can find impacts of everything from childhood play to career choices. And that I think that there's really three ways in which socialization may impact legislative behavior and effectiveness. One, this idea of shaping career choices. Of course, for a while, there was a time when women couldn't even be lawyers, which is one of the biggest feeders to Congress. Of course, is not the case anymore. But also, we can think about ways that there's distinct insights taken from different experiences. An example of this may be a woman who is in the military and who then becomes very interested, right, in something like sexual assault in the military. And then also, as we see women gaining access to a larger degree of careers, we should also see that experience reflected in their behavior once they make it to Congress. Um, Another thing to note is that for a long time, women came to Congress as either widows or other kinds of family members of their husbands, and so they really did not have prior political experience. However, by 1993, right, 1992 is the year of the woman. We see a large class of freshman women elected, and 73% of them now have had prior elected office before entering the House. And we can think about why that might be important, right? Having elective experience, as this quote I have here from Gertzog, really does give you perhaps a different kind of experience than having something like, say, being a teacher. Not that those things aren't important, but that they may predispose you to behave differently once you get to Congress, particularly if you are a woman. And so, why have I chosen floor speeches here? And I think that's because we know that certain behaviors like roll call voting are largely prescribed by partisanship. And so it's really hard to find differences there, even amongst those with different pre-congressional experiences and even those, even with gender and race being included. And so floor speeches should give more room since they are dynamic and they provide space for legislators to make multiple points that don't necessarily have to align completely with a partisan point of view. And we might also, this is a place where we could see people referencing their personal experiences as knowledge as a way to justify either a position or a policy change or creation. So I think this is perhaps a fruitful place to look for where something like experience and gender might really affect legislative behavior. Now, the data I have is so we scraped the we scraped the congressional biographical directory for all members from the 67th to the 118th Congresses. We categorized all the pre-congressional experience using a combination of automated and hand coding. So we would do some automated coding, then we would go back and we would verify 10% and then update our automated coding and then do that again until we were getting about 90% intercoder reliability. And then because each member, so we have each member in each session as an observation, we have over 20,000 observations in this data set. Just a breakdown of these are not all the variables, but the ones that are the most important for what we're talking about today. Gender is simply binary, 1 or 0. We also have party, margin of victory, the district, years of service, and of course, years of service and age are going to both increase as the member is in Congress longer. I would like to be able to look to see if there's something about being in the institution that changes someone's behavior over time. So if we see something different from a freshman as opposed to someone who's been in Congress for a longer period of time. We also have experience variables that are broken down by specific positions, mayors, governors, lieutenant governors, city council, school board, but also we group them by level. So we have federal, state, and local, and branch, executive, legislative, and judicial. So hopefully in the future, I'd like to be able to say something also about whether a different level or different branch of experience affects legislative behavior. And we have broad categories that are also 1 or 0, and I can give a list if anyone's interested on what we count as no political experience and then what we'll count as no elected experience, and do have them as two separate categories. So no political experience would be never having had a job with the party, right, at any level, never having had an elected office, of course, but also really having no exposure to politics. And that's what I would call an amateur. And then someone who has had no elective experience may have been a political operative. They may have worked for the party in some way, but they've never been elected. The elected thing could be a little tricky at the local level. We did try to look at most, and again, I have this broken down in appendix if anyone's interested, but we did try to look at most local positions and try to kind of group them by whether or not they were elected. But occasionally there are some positions that some places they're elected and some places we aren't. So they aren't. So there are perhaps there's a couple of things that are not, that we may have made a guess that could potentially be incorrect. But I don't think it would really, there's not enough of those to really harm our results. And then the data continues. So then I merge this pre-congressional data with C-SPAN floor topic data on topic and length of speaking time for the 117th and 118th Congress. And if some point there's a way to get more, I'd be happy to make a bigger, the matching obviously is easy. I'm just matching on bio ID. So if I could get more C-SPAN data, I'd be happy to expand what I have. And then you can see here, this is maybe a little bit small, but this is kind of my first cut at it, which is really looking at topic counts by party experience and gender. And so what kind of pops out right away, so the darker blue is that you have more of those, and you can see that for male Republicans, both with and without experience, President Biden was by far the topic that they spent the most time talking about, and maybe we shouldn't be too surprised by that. I think it would be interesting, and this is something that I will talk about in a minute as to things that I might dive deeper into, is to see if there's any sort of variation about how they actually do this talking, whether someone with political experience has a different approach than someone without. Then you'll also see here that the Department of Defense is something that is a relatively hot topic. And I thought this was kind of interesting, is that you can see that for Republican For the Republicans, both those with and without experience, only men talked about the Department of Defense, though women in the women Democrats and male Democrats with no experience talked about it equally. So that may be, and this is where I have to again look a little deeper. It could be that there's more veterans in the freshman class, veteran women who maybe perhaps feel a little more comfortable talking about the Department of Defense. So I need to do a little investigation there. Um, Another interesting finding here that, again, I have not looked under the covers yet, but you can see that only women with no experience are the only ones that talked about democracy. It's sort of interesting as well. Um, and also with abortion, you can see it's only women that talk about abortion, perhaps unsurprisingly, but also women with experience on the Democratic side and no experience on the Republican side. So I think that one thing that I do want to do is kind of go back and look at who some of these people are, and that way I can have a little more color to what these things actually mean beyond just giving these sort of top line numbers. And you can see also with immigration, right? As we would expect, we have Republican men talking about it, but then also Democratic women. And I suspect if we looked at these speeches, we would probably see two very different approaches to immigration, even though this is a topic that they are both talking a lot about. And then kind of the flip side of the talking about President Biden is the Democrats across the board talking about President Trump. We don't see any co-partisans talking about either president. So perhaps, again, that should be expected. And like I said, I think the preliminary conclusions are partisanship remains important, right? We can see talking about the president is one of the top things that they do, and things like the Department of Defense and abortion are both topics that you would expect Republicans and Democrats to be talking about those. And they're also, of course, gender topics, as I just showed you, and I do think there's something to be found there or to be examined there. And then additional analysis. I do want to also split it up by Congress. So right now I have them combined, and I think there would be something useful. The 117th Congress, of course, has Speaker Nancy Pelosi as Democratic majority. The 118th Congress has Speaker first Kevin McCarthy, then Mike Johnson is a Republican majority. So there might be, obviously, there's some interesting things there. I have no elected experience is what I'm showing you there. I also want to do no political experience and see if they are at all similar or if they're different. And then lastly, I would also like to look at specific career paths, including state legislators, because we know from prior research that state legislators do have a tendency to be more moderate, veterans, and then, of course, also local officials. There is some research that being a local official has a moderating effect as well. And then I would have a qualitative piece where I would look at a couple of those more of the top topics and just go a little deeper into exactly what we see coming from both men and women with and without experiences and how they are framing these topics. Thank you. That's all I have for now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So next up on the docket, if Dr. Rowley is ready, you're more than welcome to share your screen, and then we will hand it over to the discussant. Go ahead.
Great. Can you, I just realized that I usually do this with multiple screens and I only have my laptop today. So are you seeing just my PowerPoints? Okay, great. I'm going to actually read this off of paper because I couldn't figure out how to do this with only one screen. So, okay, so yeah, I'm thinking about Pat Schroeder. I'm writing a book about her. And so this is a snippet of some work I've been thinking about in terms of her family agenda and family rhetoric in the late 80s and early 1990s. And I was really glad to have a reason to dive into the C-SPAN library, and I will continue to do that as I move forward. So, okay. So Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, who was a Democrat who represented Denver, spearheaded several important legislative measures in her years in Congress, 1973 to 1997. She brought visibility to a host of left liberal political causes, and she helped institutionalize feminism. In the late 80s and early 90s, she used her positions as co-chair of the Congressional Women's Caucus, chair of the Civil Service Subcommittee, member and later chair of the Select Committee on Children, Youth, and Families, and informal dean of women in the House, back when they still used things like that. to advocate a comprehensive national family policy. And she also formulated a coherent family rhetoric, which she repeated in countless interviews, op-eds, floor debates, speeches, letters, and hearings. And she called herself the champion of the great American family, which was the title of her 1989 combination memoir and campaign book. And she really wanted to reclaim the rhetoric of family protection from the anti-feminist right and refocus family discourse on systemic causes that disproportionately harmed economically vulnerable women and children. So by the late 1980s, Schroeder had established a public role as one of the nation's most well-known feminists and as a witty and very prominent critic of the Reagan and Bush administrations. Her witticisms, including, as Robert said earlier, including her famous observation that Reagan was the Teflon president because even though his administration was beset by corruption scandals, nothing seemed to stick to him. These became very famous and widely reported in the press. And as her legislative agenda focused increasingly on family and children's issues, Schroeder resisted the new right's use of pro-family rhetoric and sought to reclaim it for feminist purposes. Instead of using the power of the state to reassert a patriarchal family order, she pursued a policy agenda that protected and empowered women and children inside and outside of nuclear families, encouraged more egalitarian caretaking roles, and enlarged social welfare programs. Her family agenda included daycare, parental leave, reproductive freedom, including assisted reproductive technologies and adoption, flexible and compressed work schedules, protection from domestic abuse, pension benefits for divorced spouses, child immunization, workplace anti-discrimination, maternal health, and pay equity. For me, she wrote in her 1989 book, building a family policy has meant finding a way to bridge the gap between public policy and the reality of women's lives. So Schroeder, who received so much attention for her unconventional profession and family life, as you can see on the screen there, her children were only 2 and 6 when she was first elected at the age of 32 in 1972, and who was so associated with feminism in the public, was a very effective figure to challenge the right's use of pro-family rhetoric, because the pro-family rhetoric had proved very savvy for the right as it used a concise, pithy phrase that cast feminists, supporters of gay rights, and liberal democratic supporters of social services as enemies of the family. Schroeder, however, was her heterosexuality and her maternality were undeniable. And so it kind of circumvented these two long-standing tropes of anti-feminist propaganda. And the right-wing movement provided an outlet for not only ideologues, but also parents resentful of federal intervention on behalf of schools desegregation, and those who saw their middle-class standard of living, including a homemaking wife and a breadwinning husband, threatened. And indeed, the changing economic realities of the 1980s helped foster a receptive audience for conservative arguments about the family. So I wanted to spend most of the time today talking about the Family and Medical Leave Act, which both represents the significance of Schroeder's family agenda and also its limits. This is arguably her most impactful legislative legacy, and I think one of the most important labor laws passed in the 20th century. She first introduced a version of the bill in 1985 and championed it for the better part of a decade until a weakened version of it was finally signed into law by President Clinton in 1993. And because of her national visibility and strategic leadership, it was, according to a Congresswomen's Caucus staff member, quote, the premier feminist concern packaged as a family issue in the late 80s, which helped to garner bipartisan support. The bill adopted a gender-neutral approach in guaranteeing job-protected unpaid leave, which was reflected by Schroeder's shifting language from maternity leave to parental leave and later family leave. This shift was particularly useful in attracting congressional Republican allies and undercutting the Reagan and Bush administration's invocation of family values as they opposed the bill. The Reagan administration fought the bill as a, quote, counterproductive intrusion into the labor market and into the rights and responsibilities of the private sector employers. So faced with mounting opposition and skepticism that a bill would survive a presidential veto, Schroeder embarked on a media blitz and kept the issue at the front of the congressional agenda for several years. So watching interviews, press conferences, and floor debates available via the C-SPAN library illuminates some of her rhetorical strategies from this period. And I have to say, I'm especially glad to be able to watch some of these speeches because she never used prepared remarks. So I've spent years in the archives reading her speeches, but I knew that that's not what she actually said. So it's great to actually be able to see how she framed these things with live audiences. So I'm just going to highlight some of these themes that I've seen in the videos on the C-SPAN library. First, while others talked about the family as an abstract ideological construct, Schroeder understood it as a social institution composed of individuals, all with their own needs and desires, some more vulnerable than others. Her frequent invocations of the traditional image family also highlighted the ways that her concept of the family differed from many of her contemporaries. While others spoke of traditional families, meaning a breadwinner father, a homemaking wife, and their minor children, Schroeder repeatedly emphasized that this so-called traditional family was a construction, more mythic than real. She added modifiers like traditional image to point out that even in the 1950s, which was supposedly idyllic, the demographic statistics never conformed to the ideal. One of her most common rhetorical strategies in this regard was to invoke imagery from television sitcoms and other popular culture, specifically Ozzie and Harriet, a 1950 sitcom, as well as Norman Rockwell's paintings, which were two references that she returned to repeatedly. These highlighted the constructedness of the nuclear family norm and the historical specificity of the breadwinner homemaker economic model. For example, in a 1989 press conference on the passage of child care amendments to the annual budget, she praised Congress for being enlightened enough to recognize that society had changed. She said, "We did this even though most people thought we were a kind of leave it to Beaver Congress in a Kate and Allie world." So she loved to pull these pop culture references. But in doing that, she denaturalized the middle class family norm. A second theme for Schroeder was the plight of American families. In multiple speeches, she referred to individual families as building blocks for society and raised the concern that societal foundation was crumbling amid economic pressures and psychological distress caused by lack of support for working parents. Here, she was trying to find common ground with people across the political spectrum who saw troubles with the family, singular. However, while conservatives placed the blame on 1960s social movements, including feminism and the free speech movement, and on vague diagnoses of cultural decline, Schroeder had a fundamentally feminist analysis of the problem that was based in economic equity and labor rights. However, her vision was also rooted in a relatively conservative shared value of upward mobility. She argued that the middle class American dream, which she defined as a house, a car, healthcare, and college tuition for kids, was still alive, but was out of reach now for most households without two wage earners. Given the shrinking middle class due to Reagan's tax policies, she argued, ordinary people were under economic stress. She said, "We have been waiting 8 years for it to trickle down, and we aren't even damp," in a 1991 speech. So by emphasizing pressure on ordinary families, Schroeder shifted the discourse from right-wing claims about women abandoning their families for jobs. This really wasn't about women's choice to participate in the workforce. Rather, it was about the need to shore up a shared American dream of a vast and stable middle class. And this was also a way for Schroeder to counter a claim by right-wing opponents, including anti-feminist activist Phyllis Schlafly and Republican Congressman Steve Bartlett, that the FMLA would only benefit yuppies because they would be the only ones able to afford unpaid leave from their jobs. Schroeder said that it wasn't about yuppies. It was about, quote, what everyone wants and has always wanted. It was about the stress of young people trying to meet the dream that their parents achieved. She often repeated the line that more women were working for pay because if they didn't, their houses would be repossessed. So in this way, Schroeder de-emphasized the most controversial aspect of the structural economic shift, the ways that anti-discrimination law and mass feminist activism had increased women's opportunities in professional workplaces. She also focused on economic inequality in Reagan's America, and she justified what some saw as government intrusion into the private market by noting the economic hardship that threatened the shared social value of the American dream. Another theme that Schroeder raised repeatedly in her speeches was children's well-being. One of the strategies that she used was to emphasize that, quote, these aren't women's issues, they're whole society issues, as she said in a 1989 congressional panel. She, in particular, focused on early child development as a social good that would benefit from parental leave. And here she relied on expert testimony from Dr. T. Barry Brazelton, who was a leading pediatrician who she started inviting in to testify before Congress starting in 1983. And after her very brief exploratory presidential campaign, which is a whole nother story, in 1987, she embarked on a Great American Family Tour with Dr. Brazelton to raise national visibility for the FMLA and other family policies, and also to demonstrate that family issues affected men as well as women. So she took him along to these states right before the primary season in 1988 and talked about his research, which highlighted the importance of child-parent bonding in the first 4 months of life. On that tour and in speeches and interviews elsewhere, Schroeder repeatedly argued that having time together in the first months of life would prevent long-term problems in the future, both for the children and the parents. She said, it's pay now or pay later, to a 1988 speech before the National Conference of State Legislatures. She frequently raised the issue of crime, the specter of crime, which was a top political issue in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But she redirected the focus away from jails and executions, as she characterized the Republicans' agenda, and instead focused on future social and economic costs of crime and prisons and violence, which she argued could be prevented by ensuring solid family bonding through job-protected leave, parental leave. Meanwhile, she explained to the National Press Club in 1988, parents who had to choose between their parental roles and their roles as workers were stricken by psychological distress that further stressed marriages and contributed to the really high divorce rate. So she argued also that rates of suicide, teen pregnancy, alcohol abuse, and domestic violence would also be helped by passing parental leave. In other words, liberal labor protections were necessary to protect the middle-class family. Fourth, in her speeches and comments, Schroeder repeatedly raised the problem of empty rhetoric and self-interested politicians. She liked to use the term power issue, as in children are not a power issue. Family is not a power issue in Washington. She often noted that children don't have PACs with large numbers of well-funded lobbyists. Instead, powerful business groups like the Chamber of Congress and National Federation of Independent Businesses, who opposed FMLA, were able to exert their influence over the White House and congressional conservative allies. Lots of politicians, including George Bush, who she pointedly criticized for this, campaigned on family values and endorsed ending the marriage tax penalty and passing job-protected leave, but they just talked about family values and didn't actually vote for the family issues, such as FMLA, child immunization programs, funding Head Start, childcare, etc. She said, how can he talk family values and then threaten to veto anything that reflects family values, which is something that she said on a call-in show on C-SPAN in 1990. She argued that American voters were tired of politicians who keep talking family values but voting corporate values. So this not only continued her pointed criticisms of Reagan and Bush, which she had already had a solid foundation for the previous decade, it also tied into her long-term agenda of political reform and grassroots political power, which had been a priority of hers since her first election, and which she'd backed up with multiple legislative efforts and personal ethical practices. Finally, a theme in Schroeder's family rhetoric was burden sharing. She argued that the United States would have billions of dollars for domestic social programs if it weren't bearing the dominant share of the cost of its developed industrialized allies' military defense, including trade competitors such as Germany and Japan. She frequently invoked Truman and Eisenhower as a way to point out that the foreign policy of the immediate post-World War II era made no common sense for the economic and geopolitical realities of the late 20th century. And here she refuted the business community and Reagan and Bush's arguments about costly government programs, including FMLA, while also reinforcing her long-term critique of Cold War militarism, which again had been a main issue for her since she was first elected. She was on the Armed Services Committee. She also pointed out that countries with socialized healthcare, higher education, parental leave, and childcare were able to cover those benefits because Americans paid for their defense. So conservative arguments about tax burdens were specious. Americans paid thrice. first for their allies' defense, second for their own measly government social safety net programs, and third for childcare, healthcare, et cetera, in the private marketplace. Conservatives argued that there was no money to pay for these programs, but Schroeder claimed in 1989 that there was money, it was just being spent on the Pentagon. In 1987, she argued that, quote, we're draining the investment we need to be making in our young people, in our future, in order to pay for other countries' defense. And that same year, in a speech to the Center for American Women in Politics, she used this logic specifically to go after Reagan's foreign policy in the Persian Gulf, saying that Americans were stripping their future by cutting social programs in order to spread thin the American flag abroad and potentially start World War III, she said. So this line of argumentation drew on a common desire to maintain international competitiveness, and it helped Schroeder deflect periodic charges of socialism or even communistic tendencies from right-wing colleagues, commentators, and sometimes callers into C-SPAN shows, while maintaining the focus on children and families. And people indeed did engage with Schroeder via C-SPAN, either by calling in to ask her questions or share their comments when she was participating in an interview show, or by writing her a letter after seeing her on television. I've seen tons of those in her archives. They shared their stories with medical problems, economic distress, and job discrimination. They occasionally spewed invective, and they asked questions about the bill or expressed their support for it. She used those television appearances and exchanges via mail to encourage ordinary people to share their personal stories with George Bush in an attempt to get so-called Gentle George to recognize the human need for FMLA. And her congressional allies started to echo Schroeder's rhetoric, with people like Senator Chris Dodd, who introduced the bill in the Senate, calling FMLA both pro-business and pro-family. So this framing of FMLA as pro-family was effective at attracting support. And gradually, conservatives realized that they couldn't fight the popularity of the premise of maternity leave and of Schroeder's pro-family rhetoric. She worked across partisan lines and got the support of some key Republicans, including a major coup. She got the very conservative Illinois Republican Henry Hyde, who was most famous for his annual budget riders restricting government funding for abortions, who in 1989 spoke on the floor supporting FMLA, while his colleague Tom DeLay was arguing that the bill was anti-family because it would force both parents to work. Hyde maintained that, as you can see on the screen, it seems to me if a working woman becomes pregnant, she needs to have job security to have an incentive to have that child, not to exterminate that child so she does not lose her job. So he turned this into a sort of like anti-abortion argument. And he said very few bills seem to involve apple pie and motherhood. And it seems that this one is a good. So I'm going to support this bill. And that helped bring other conservative Republicans onto supporting the bill. But the Reagan and Bush administrations continue to oppose it. Instead, they propose countermeasures to try to head off a new government-mandated leave policy. And they even appropriated some of Schroeder's rhetoric while conceding key points of the feminist message, which just proves how much widespread support there actually was for this kind of policy. In 1986, Reagan's Office of Personnel Management director responded to Schroeder's introduction of the bill by issuing new guidelines to federal government managers, encouraging them to be flexible in granting not only traditional maternity leave, but also leave for adoption, foster care, and the care of sick children or elderly parents. And here she actually, the OPM director actually used the term parental leave, not maternity leave, which reflected how this policy was influenced by Schroeder's equal treatment feminist approach. And the success of her rhetoric in the language of her supporters. In her memo announcing the change, the OPM director boasted that Reagan had emphasized the importance of strengthening family values and that this policy would help do so. But then the following year, she turned around and used the existence of that new policy to argue that the bill wasn't necessary to mandate it in law. So she's sort of like having it both ways, which Schroeder repeatedly highlighted was a contradiction between, again, the rhetoric of family values on the one hand and the lack of support for the minimum labor standard on the other. But nonetheless, broad-based support for the bill continued to grow into George Bush's presidency, with over 150 organizations from Catholic archdioceses to pediatric physicians to labor unions to the Junior League supporting and lobbying for the FMLA. And despite indicating that he might support job protected leave, George Bush vetoed the bill twice. Um, Schroeder and her allies failed to have enough votes to override the veto either time. But after years of refusing to negotiate, when it looked like FMLA would pass the second time in 1992, Bush kind of half-heartedly endorsed voluntary leave policies, which already existed, and vague tax initiatives to help working parents, which I think reflects the, again, widespread support and the success of Schroeder's lobbying and rhetoric for this. So they couldn't override the veto, but it became a talking point in the 1992 elections, which featured a very contentious internecine Republican battle during the primaries, and in which right-wing candidate Pat Buchanan declared a cultural war in America. And Bill Clinton, who promised to sign it, did follow through. It was one of the first things he did after being sworn in his first term in 1993. So I think that trying to reclaim the pro-family rhetoric from the religious right was never as successful as Schroeder hoped it might be. Pro-family and family values, I think, still maintained their primary identification with anti-feminist, anti-gay ideology. And indeed, while Schroeder's vision of the family encompassed a much broader definition than a two-parent heterosexual nuclear unit, the larger cultural and political meaning of family most typically evoked that stereotype. Moreover, by engaging in the rhetoric of such conservative talking points as the family in crisis or the crime crisis, I think she might have unwittingly fed the flames of conservative culture wars discourse. But Schroeder made use of the traditional associations between motherhood, morality, and child protection without being limited to a narrow construction of the middle-class nuclear family. Instead, she pushed for an expansive definition of pro-family policies informed by a progressive and class-conscious feminism, that the federal government should ensure economic security for the poor through social services, that they should enable flexible work and dependent care options for Americans, that they should safeguard vulnerable children, and that they should ensure safe and accessible reproductive health care. While she lost many battles over her family policy agenda, and while the victories were the results of compromise that significantly watered them down, including FMLA, Schroeder's legislative legacy includes multiple measures that improve the health and economic security of millions of Americans. And her very public use of pro-family rhetoric helped reframe the terms of politics by the early 1990s. So by centering the family in her rhetoric and repeatedly inserting family-oriented proposals into a wide range of legislative areas, she played a major role in shifting family values from the sole purview of the Reaganite right. Taking her cue, other liberal and Democratic politicians saw utility in claiming family protection, but few were as effective and few backed up their rhetoric with as strong a policy record as Schroeder. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I certainly sympathize with Dr. Rowley about the difficulties of doing this single monitors trick, but I have figured it out. So, doing presenter view on the Mac, it's Control Up to get back to Zoom, and then let me replace the current share, and then I will select this one. All right. Thank you so much. Two fantastic presentations. So now I want to briefly introduce our moderator, Dr. Amber Lasvardi. So she is an associate professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, whose work examines how gender and justice issues such as child marriage bans and state-level transgender policy reach legislative agenda and shape public debates through social movements and state politics. Her dissertation, The End of the Child Bride, published in 2022, received the 2023 Best Dissertation Award from APSA's State Politics and Policy section. Her research appears in outlets including Journal of Women and Politics and Policy, or Journal of Women, Politics and Policy, International Studies Quarterly, Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, and the Journal of Information Technology and Politics. And she contributes public scholarships in venues like the former Washington Post Monkey Cage. So let me stop sharing my screen and I will hand it over to Dr. Lasvardi.
Thank you very much. It's so great to be here. I'm glad to at least virtually be back at my alma mater, if not in person. So it was great to get to read both of these papers over the weekend. I really enjoyed it. So I just put together some brief comments to hopefully kick off the Q&A, and I'll start with Dr. Pluta's paper. This hit me at a really interesting time because I just taught my gender and politics class last week, Mary Hawksworth's Congress as a Race-Gendered Institution. And so I had been just spending some time talking about, thinking about the concept of representation, specifically thinking about substantive representation and like how these identities play into how we represent people. So I was thinking about how important this work is in terms of not just adding on one more variable. So we have this race information, we have this gender information, and now we have this congressional past experience information, but thinking of legislators as whole people who have all of these kind of varied aspects to their lives that bring together who they are. I sometimes think of Sonia Sotomayor on the Supreme Court and how she talks about growing up low socioeconomic status, like really having to work her way through school. That's really informed the way that she looks at the law. And I feel like your data set has the ability to give us some of that insight as well. I was really struck by how large your data set is. I also am very sympathetic because I also have a project in which my co-author left the academy, and I'm also left with the rest of this project. So you have my sympathies there. But this is a huge data set. I think it's really important. And I was thinking just about like my intro American government textbook, where like, it's broken down. Where do people come to Congress from? They're lawyers, they're business people, they're teachers. But to have that added layer of knowing like, what's that breakdown by race? What's that breakdown by gender to give us a little bit more complexity to that understanding and maybe how that might map on to education, how that might map on to past socioeconomic status could give us a better sense of what that whole person looks like. I'm guessing that as you dive more into this data, you're going to find that partisanship is this hard divide, right? So like as we try to find these commonalities across groups, that we have the Democrats, we have the Republicans, and you kind of noted that in your analysis a bit. But I do think it would be really interesting then if you can find whatever if the cases exist, whatever they are, of like where is there solidarity among women, among people of color, like all different groups, where does that solidarity exist across partisanship? And maybe in recent years we don't see it at all, but maybe there was a time where we saw it, or maybe there was a time period, maybe there's a time period where we saw it. I don't know, but I think that would be really interesting to know. I think that'd be a really interesting like pull out paper. So I think this is really interesting. I think it's an amazing data set to have. I think it has so many possibilities. I'm sure the only limits are your individual time and ability to analyze so much data, but I'm really glad to have gotten a chance to at least look at it. And I will switch over to Dr. Rowley. Something that struck me as I was reading your paper is I hadn't thought about Pat Schroeder, I think for many years. At this point, I was thinking, I think there's an old clip of her crying where people got really mad, right? They were like mad that she was crying and she wasn't representing women well. And that came to mind as I brought up your paper. But I was just thinking about, even though we're talking about the 70s into the 1980s, how relevant all of these things still are, right? We're like 30 years into the future. All of these are all conversations we're still talking about family medical leave, which is incredible. We're still talking about gender roles, the place of the family in society, what that means, what that looks like. We're still trying to dispel sort of this typical heteronormative family. Um, and I think what she did, or as you describe what she did, is try to continuously frame and reframe issues to try to bring people in and create this consensus. And the question I had as I was reading it is, who do you think all of these speeches were for? And what I mean by that is to say, did other members of Congress, did other people in the House overwhelmingly pick up her frame? Because I'm thinking when she started Congress, she's probably one of like 15 women in Congress, maybe. And by the time she left, I'm guessing one of like 30-ish. women in Congress, so there's still like a lot of tokenism happening. Did people in Congress itself like rally around these frames and these reframes, or do you think the speeches were mostly for the public? Like this is really about public opinion. It's really about getting like solidarity from the masses and hoping that pressure then creates pressure on members of Congress to pay attention and to care. Like which way does that causal arrow, so to speak, go? So I thought again, I can't wait to read more about it. I hadn't thought for a while about what an interesting and important figure she is. So I'm glad for you to have brought her back into my life. All right, I will leave it there.
Thank you so much for the comments. So we will open it up to the audience to see if anybody has any questions. We'll do that for a couple of minutes, and then yeah, and then we will call it a day for the first day of the CCSE research conference. So does anybody have any immediate questions? I can see that Robert's winding up. Like I can tell he's ready.
I'm sorry I can't find my hand there, but on the big data set, can you tell me why, if you have 20,000 records, I know we don't, the C-SPAN archives doesn't go back as far, but why did you just use 117th and 118th?
That's all they gave me.
Oh,
I would
okay.
take whatever I could get, but that's all they
All
could
right.
give me.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, like I said, if it's possible to get more, it's very easy to merge them. So I'm happy to have as many as I can have.
Okay. All right. That's good to know. Thank you. We could see how we can help there. Good.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask a question since we're on that particular paper. So I liked this discussion in the slide about different types of experience, like past legislative experience. You had a kind of a typology. Like how do you think that interacts with something like gender to affect topics? Like I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, even though you haven't directly looked at it yet. Do you have any hunches about how that would look?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of know from other literature that like being a state legislator is probably going to make someone more, I would think, open to discussing some of these more complicated topics that would require more legislative effort. And then I was thinking a little bit about political amateurs and whether there's not some incentive to sort of grasp onto some of these more flashy things, like talking about the opposition president or talking perhaps about immigration. And I do think the more I think about it, the more I think it'll be interesting to kind of look at some examples of the rhetoric coming from just pull some random sample of people in each of these groups and just see how it looks with someone or are there differences, right? How a freshman talks as to how someone who has more experience, and then of course across gender and whether there are some ways in which language is used that might be instructive from past experiences, through the lens of gender. So yeah, I think there's tons to do there. I just kind of have to really dig in and get into. I think I could take it a number of ways, right? I could do something more quantitative, but I think it could be just as interesting to do some sort of qualitative um, deep dive that lets me kind of get at some of the content of the rhetoric beyond just the topics.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to pause for a second, see if anybody else has something. Going once, going twice.
Can
I
I
don't.
say, can I say
Yeah, go
something about
ahead.
ands? Just to jump on that, I was thinking about how interesting it might be to think about this like historical comparisons there too, because, I was thinking of people like Lindy Boggs and Cardis Collins who were in Congress in the 70s when I'm doing my work. And they weren't elected officials before, but they had a lot of political experience as political spouses. So like, I wonder, I mean, obviously that's a completely different environment for women who are running for office now, but I don't think that necessarily like comparing the data between like the 70s and the 2020s or whatever would like give it's not apples and oranges, I guess is what I'm saying, particularly for women.
Well, in some ways, the 70s are so interesting, though, because you have the feminist movement is ascendant, and you almost have a bipartisan understanding of like, yeah, this is what we're doing, before it kind of breaks down in the late 70s and early 80s. So there might be something there, and I like to I'm writing another book about gender in the presidency, and so I've kind of been in that like frame of mind anyway, and so there might be something there that I can kind of also latch onto that might be really interesting. So thank you.
So I want to ask one question of Dr. Rowley's paper, and then I will talk about what's going to be happening tomorrow. So I so I've written several papers now about descriptive representation on Capitol Hill, specifically women and racial and ethnic groups. So I very much enjoyed your talk. So how important is Pat Schroeder to this broader question of, representing women on Capitol Hill? I mean, you have studied the history much better than I have in terms of like her place in the pantheon of members of Congress, but where would you place her in terms of her influence on the representation of women on Capitol Hill?
I think she's extremely important and has not gotten her due, which is why I'm trying to rectify that with the book. Yeah, I have to confess I'm not familiar with all of the political science literature, so I apologize. But I think she's really interesting because you have this cohort that are elected in the late 60s and early 70s, who we have started finally to get biographies of: Shirley Chisholm and Patsy Mink and Barbara Jordan, who broke all these boundaries and passed this really important feminist who advocated really important feminist legislation. Of course, there were 12 of them, so it's not like they passed it. Um, but most of them are gone by 1980. They left to run for the Senate or they retired for other reasons. And then you get, as you said, the Year of the Woman in 1992, and you have this whole new cohort come in. And that's where you get, all these folks, Nancy Pelosi and all these people. But she's the one who bridges that entire span. So I think she actually has a lot to tell us about the women's political movement and how women's roles in politics changed. Again, she ran for president briefly in 1987, and I want to talk to you more maybe about gender and the presidency stuff. But so yeah, I think she's incredibly important, and she's this often like lone champion for these feminist policies out there in the Reagan 80s, just sort of insisting on using this outsider positionality, even despite the fact that by that time she's already the most senior woman in Congress, but it's because the numbers were so low. And Amber, let me just very, very, very quickly, I promise I'll be brief, say I do think it was mainly for the masses because they had hearings on this since 1985, 86. They had amassed, I mean, congressmen wouldn't say I'm against family leave because they saw how reasonable and how cheap a policy was. It was for unpaid job protected leave. They were just saying you can't be fired for getting pregnant or having cancer, basically. But so the only people who are really arguing against it is the Chamber of Congress and the lobbyists for the small businesses. And so they had their spokespersons in Congress, but Congress people were basically on board with this starting in like 1980, by like 1988. It was just that they had to worry about it getting vetoed. And so they had to she was trying to raise enough public demand to put pressure on the White House so that they wouldn't veto the bill once they got it passed. So I do think that the media effort was in large part of public relations with the ordinary sort of voters and normal people rather than her congressional allies per se.
With that, I will conclude the first day of the CCSE research conference. Thank you all for joining us. Very much appreciated the papers in this session as well as our first session, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Take care.